At the beginning of the biodesign class, the vignette that we were given was really focused around mental health, specifically focused on a man who, with the pandemic, was experiencing increased isolation and depression. And he had a family history of depression and suicidal ideation. And so what we did as a group was take that vignette away and really think about what about mental health in the pandemic would be really heightened, but then also as we were transitioning from the pandemic life into more normal life again, what parts of mental health might be heightened in that transition as well.
So during the research phase of figuring out what was the need statement we wanted to converge on, we started off with a brainstorming session with the entire team, and so this was dedicated time to really diverge on all the possible directions we could take within the mental health space. We essentially were brainstorming within this specific need area, and we figured out what were the topics of interest, and that ended up being around 30 topics of interest. And once we figured out what those topics were, we looked at it more critically and really distinguished what were need areas and filtered out what were possible potential solutions to those need areas. And then within that refined list, we then conducted in-depth research on those need areas.
After our brainstorming session, in which we identified about 10 different topics, anything from parental mental health during the pandemic to more serious mental health disorders, substance abuse, and a few others, we looked at the list and each of us took away one that we were particularly interested in. So for example, I took away the impacts of social media and isolation during the pandemic. And with that, we conducted some initial research on what is the demographic that is truly impacted by this health effect, and what is the disease mechanism. Are there currently solutions out there? How much research has been done in this space? And once we all had some of that information for about 5 different topics, we brought it back together and continued the conversation from there.
So after we did the in-depth research, we essentially came together and presented the topics that we conducted our research on and presented it to the rest of the team. And then after each presentation, we essentially did a quick question and answer segment and discussed the topic further before proceeding to another topic and discussing another topic. And then after all of the presentations, we then went through this voting system wherein we anonymously voted on the top 3 topics within the top 10 that we refined from the initial list. And then from there, we converged on one need area. So after the vote, we revealed the results, and the statistics told us that 50% of the team ended up choosing the number 1 topic, which ended up being nicotine dependence in young adults.
The result of focusing on nicotine dependence in young adults, it wasn't my top choice, but I think what really helped us in that process was before the vote, we had a really strong dialogue around what the process would be. We agreed to that, and then we also agreed to respect and honor the voting system. And so once the vote was done, we all made a commitment to pursuing forward with that need statement. And my experience was the more we talked about the target demographic that we would be focusing on, the more excited I got about the topic, and I think that just really reminded me to keep my mind open. You never know where you're going to end up in these conversations, but just because it's not your top choice doesn't mean it's not incredibly exciting and interesting to work on. It was a bit overwhelming being given the topic of mental health because it was so broad, and if we hadn't whittled it down to a more specific need area, it wouldn't have been actionable. So really having the discipline to focus in on a specific need within that space allowed the rest of the process to become much easier and simpler and more focused.
It was very important for us to adopt a very structured approach in filtering that down and converging and being really content with what we landed on.